But thanks for joining us. And we've got Ralph Ellis with us. How are you doing, Ralph?
Very well, thanks, Phil. Good to see you, Ben. Or should I call you Ralph?
Call me whatever you like.
Honestly, I'll leave you two for 2 minutes while I set the stream going, and you're swapping Zoom around and confusing me. Oh, my God. Giddy aunt. Well, as we were saying, Ralph, you're an author, you're a historian, a grand heretic of all sorts of stripes, whether it's,
yes.
you know, Old Testament, New Testament, climate change, all the rest of it. And as I was saying before, your books span such a huge period of time that we're a bit stuffed, really, to get through it all in any you know, unless we're going to keep recording till, you know, the early hours of the morning. So I thought it would be a good idea to go to the start, if you like, to the Garden of Eden, to the late Bronze Age, and sort of give us an idea of, like, your work in this area, what discoveries you've made, and how your work differs from what I guess people would describe as the mainstream historical narrative that we're all taught.
Yeah, so yes, Ralph Ellis, I'm a bit of a polymath, you know. I've been at this a long time. I've been doing this for 40 years or so. Started when I was 14. I just had an interest in this for some reason, don't know why. And written, I don't know, 12 books, 13 books, I can't remember now. It's getting too many. On basically revisionary theology, I call it, because I'm looking at this from a very different perspective. I'm looking at this from a Gnostic atheist perspective. So I'm looking at the history, not the religion. And so it gives me sort of an opportunity to look at this with fresh eyes and see if I can find any real history in it, because the problem with all of the biblical texts, actually, whether you're looking at Old Testament or New Testament, is it's missing from the historical record. I mean, it's just not there. And, you know, a long time ago, I realized that really there should be some history here. I mean, it sort of reads historical, some of this stuff. So we're either looking in the wrong era or perhaps in the wrong location. And there's been a variety of those. Sometimes we're looking in the wrong era, sometimes the wrong location. And yeah, we can look at Genesis, but I didn't start with Genesis because I never thought I would ever find anything historical in Genesis. I mean, it just reads like mythology, basically. But after researching this and writing about 5 books already, I suddenly found there were sort of many links with the Amarna dynasty of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Right. So, I mean, the first one that stood out, of course, is the description of Eden, where a river flows through the garden, and from thence it is parted and becomes 4 branches. Well, that's a very particular river, you know, to do that. There's not many rivers that do that, and the only one in that region that actually does that is the Nile. It runs through the strip oasis of Egypt itself, and then it gets to Cairo and it branches off, and it becomes 4 branches.
Oh, right, because there's like the White Nile and the Blue Nile, and
yes,
is that
but when it gets to the when it gets to the other end, when it gets to the delta, it splits up, and in ancient history, it used to split into 4. Now it only splits into 2, but anyway, it used to split into 4. And so that's a very, very good description of the River Nile. And so I'd already done a lot of work on the Old Testament, so I knew the sort of links that I was looking at. And the basic premise was that the Genesis story, which reads as ahistorical, is actually a copy of the hymn to the Arton by Pharaoh Akhenaten himself. He was supposed to have written it himself. And the hymn to the Arton is a hymn to the dawn of the new day. But in the biblical story, someone has interpreted this as being a Genesis, you know, a creation epic, but it wasn't. And so we have this epic about the creation story, creating man and woman, all the rest of it. But the details are fairly specific. We have a man and a woman who are always naked. standing in the garden of the Eden, or the Eden. And of course, that's exactly what Akhenaten and Nefertiti did. If you look at their imagery, they're always naked, strolling around in the garden of the Aten. And the Aten is their god. It was called the Aten, or actually we should really pronounce it as being the Eten, a bit like the old public school. It was the Eten, or the Eden. It was spelt in the hieroglyphic. And so they had a garden of the Eten. That was their garden of the gods. All of these pharaohs used to make a garden to the gods, which was a walled garden, a bit like you would have at a country house, which if you go across to Persia, it's known as a paradise. That's where we get the word from. And so there was a garden of the Eten, and that was at Amarna in central Egypt. And that is why the god of the Israelites is called the Arden, or the Aten. So their god has, it's supposed to be only one god, of course, but he has many names. He's El, Elohim, Allah, he's called Yahweh, and he's called the Arden. Not many people mention that, but the Israelite god is called the Arden. And of course, the god of Akhenaten was called the Arden, or the Aten. It's the same god name. And of course, remember that Akhenaten invented monotheism, just as the Israelites invented monotheism. There are many links between these two peoples, because I think that the Israelites were always resident, resident for a long, long time. In Egypt, they were Egyptians. And so that little epic comes from my book, Eden in Egypt. But then we jump back really to get some perspective on this, to the Exodus story. So effectively what I'm saying is the Genesis story is out of place. It actually comes later, but somebody thought it was a creation epic, and so they stuffed it at the beginning of the Bible where it shouldn't really be.
Editors.
Yeah, editors. Oh, they're the same all the time, you know. What actually happened is there were two exoduses. So, and we have this from Manetho, who was the 3rd century BC historian who gave us a lot of this history. And he said there were two exoduses. There was a big one and the small one. And the exodus of when Akhenaten was thrown out of his new city, he was the heretic pharaoh. He was kicked out by his father, basically, because he had these strange ideas about religion, and he formed a hippie commune and went down to Middle Egypt and set up a new city down there with his commune of hippies. And in Manetho, he calls them the 80,000 maimed priests and lepers who set up a new city at the quarries on the east bank of the Nile. And of course, that's exactly where Amarna is, down in Middle Egypt. And yeah, they're rather missing the point here, because Josephus gets all upset and says you can't have 80,000 lepers, it's just not possible. He's being a bit irrational here. Quite obviously what Manetho is saying is they were theological lepers, they weren't real lepers, because he had this new cult of the Aten. And if people don't know what the Aten is, and setting up this new cult and how it would have been for Akhenaten in Egypt. I mean, this is 1340 BC. It's a long, long time ago. It's 3,300 years ago. So it's quite a long time ago. But if you watch Wild Wild Country by Netflix, that is exactly what happened to Akhenaten. So Wild Wild Country is actually a story about a Indian guru who set up a colony in Oregon, I think it was. Anyway, he had all these followers and they all charged off into the middle of nowhere in Oregon and set up this new cult city. And the story of their rise and wealth, and then the infighting and their demise, is exactly the same as Akhenaten. Akhenaten managed to last, I don't know what it was actually, it was probably about 20 odd years before it dissolved into chaos. And they were pushed out on an exodus. Now, you'll find a lot of historians say that Akhenaten and Nefertiti died there. There is no evidence whatsoever that they died at Amarna. Their tombs were never used. And I think that Manetho is correct, and they were pushed out onto an exodus. And so they were pushed out of Middle Egypt. And of course, when they had to go on this exodus, they had to put clothes on. They had to cover up exactly the same as Adam and Eve. And so, and that becomes pertinent to the story when we come to the religion of Jesus later on, which we might talk about in another show. Yeah. But that was the small exodus. That was the exodus of Akhenaten and Nefertiti and his 80,000 maimed priests and lepers when they got pushed out of Amarna.
And was that the like more established priesthoods at Thebes and other cities that forced them out?
Yeah, well, he closed them all down, of course. This is why they hated him, because he was the heretic pharaoh who not only set up a commune, but he obviously gained control over the army, and he shut down all of the main temples. And so the standard temples to Amun and all of the other standard gods of Egypt had all been closed down for 10 or more years. And that's why they wanted to get rid of him, of course, because they lost their temples, they lost their jobs, they lost their prestige within society, and they wanted him gone. And they finally got rid of him, pushed him out. So yes, he became the heretic pharaoh, and his name was cut out all across Egypt. Nobody knew about him for until the 1800s, just 200 years ago. And then people started finding evidence of Akhenaten. His name had been cut out from across the land.
Wow. And presumably the Amarna letters reference him a lot, seeing as he set up the place.
Yeah. Yeah,
and that's
indeed they do.
That's a very recent discovery.
Yeah, recent discovery.
Yeah.
So we actually know quite a lot about Amarna because it was abandoned.
Right. Yeah, it's ironic.
It is, yeah. That the whole place, nobody ever lived there again. It was just abandoned. It was destroyed, and anything that was there survived because no one lived there again. And so things like the bust of Nefertiti, which you probably know from the Berlin Museum, was still lying there under the dust. It obviously been left completely, not even destroyed, and it was sitting on a shelf. And eventually the shelf rotted away, and all of those busts just dropped to the floor. And luckily they didn't get broken very much. And there they lay, and they were just sitting under the sand.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that's how we managed to find out so much information about Akhenaten.
So was no mummies or corpses, potential bodies found for Akhenaten and Nefertiti?
No, never been found. They mentioned KV 55 down in the Valley of the Kings, but I don't believe that's Akhenaten. It's too young. And I think that was probably Smenkhara, who was the pharaoh who came after Akhenaten. He only lasted about 2 years before Tutankhamun. So yeah, they've never been found. And it was probably a part of this Exodus business that they were thrown out on an Exodus. And we have a record of the next pharaoh being thrown out, which was Pharaoh I. So we had Akhenaten, Smenkhara, Tutankhamun, and then Pharaoh I. I had been the sort of like army commander in charge of Amarna, and then he elected himself into being pharaoh after Tutankhamun died. But we have his history from Scottish history, which is not very well known about. But anyway, the ancient history of the Scots and the Irish, and this goes back to the 14th century in Scotland, which is called Scotichronicon, and back to the 6th century in Ireland, that's the Laborla Gabala. And they say that Pharaoh I, who they call Scotia and Gaithalos, was kicked out of Egypt because, again, he disappeared. We don't have his mummy. And he was told to go because he tried to go back to the old religion. Tutankhamun let's start from Akhenaten. So Akhenaten changed the religion into the Aten. Tutankhamun was forced, because he was only a youngster, he was forced to go back to the old gods and abandon the Aten. And then I took over, and he scrapped all that and went back to the Aten again. And of course, there was a lot of people who didn't like that move. And so I got kicked out after 4 years. And Scottish history says that he was given 60 ships to organize an exodus and go. He was told to go and never come back home again. And so according to Scottish history, he went up to Spain, to the Ebro Peninsula on the east coast of Spain, and to Majorca as well. They occupied Majorca. And then after a couple of generations or so, they sailed round to Ireland and ended up in the Dingle Peninsula in Ireland. And then they went to Scotland. So that's Scottish history. You know, a lot of people just say it's pure mythology, but I went through this in my book, Scotia, the Egyptian Queen of the Scots. And there seems to be a lot of history there that does indicate it may well be, may well have been true. It was a proper exodus. So this little band of people, 500, maximum of 1,000 people, probably 500, went on an exodus and set up colonies in Ireland and Scotland because they said it was uninhabited and therefore they could live there without any oppression from other people.
I read a book about 12 months ago, and that was positing the theory of Scotia being being a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti who fled. Yes. Is that the? Have you come to the same conclusion, or is it another generation?
I don't know which one that was, but I came to the same conclusion. So Scotia would have been Akhenaten. And Akhenaten was, she married her father, first of all, Akhenaten. Then she married her cousin, I think, which was Tutankhamun. She became queen when she married Tutankhamun. And then she married I, who would have been her uncle or something of that nature. Right. So she became queen again with Pharaoh I, and they were kicked out of Egypt. So yes, Scotia would have been a daughter of Akhenaten.
I know there was some boats that were found somewhere, I think in the northeast of England.
Yes, the Dover boats. So yeah, the Dover boats were interesting because they were sewn boats from the Bronze Age era, which is exactly what they were using in Egypt. And the bigger one, not so famous, but the bigger one, the one that's more complete, is the Dover boat, if you go to the museum in Dover. And that's quite a large boat. It's not exactly seagoing, but at least it's sort of inland capable. It looks like a bit of like a sort of Oxford or Cambridge punt, basically, flat bottom sort of thing. Mm. But again, they're Bronze Age. I mean, they're more than 3,000 years old. You know, they're very old.
And we often talk about this, but we often forget how interconnected the Mediterranean world was in this period, the late Bronze Age, when it comes to trade. You know, what did Eric Klein say? Something about 2 degrees of separation. You know, every major power, like if the Egyptians, if the Egyptians knew the Hittites, but maybe they didn't know, you know, some other empire, but they were always only separated by 1 or 2 empires. It was a very, he calls it like the ancient Bronze Age G7, the way things worked back then.
Well, yes, especially if this exodus is true that they're talking about of Scotia and Gayphalos, because they populated all of the islands across the Mediterranean, because the islands were fairly safe places that they could set up new empires, because they were the dominant civilization. They had expertise and they had weaponry that, you know, the people on the islands wouldn't have had, so they could easily dominate them. And it's likely that they set up exiled populations on lots of these islands.
Do you think do you think they even had relationships already? you know, or like trade relationships? Do you think they will have had connections on the island?
They did in the Eastern Mediterranean because they had strong connections with the Minoans, because the Minoans were the great traders of that era. And if you wanted anything sending across the Mediterranean, you used the Minoans. They were the shipping company. And so, yes, they would have had very strong relationships with the Minoans. And the Minoans eventually set up a palace in the Nile Delta after the major eruption, which we're going to talk about, of Santorini, which almost destroyed the Minoan Empire. And that sort of brings us on, I suppose, to the Exodus, the proper Exodus, not the little one, but the proper one. So actually, with the proper Exodus, the two brothers, what's happened is in the biblical story, they've conflated these two Exoduses into one. And so the two prime characters within this Exodus story actually come from Amarna. So the Aaron and Moses, the two brothers of the Exodus, were actually Akhenaten and Tuthmoses, the two brothers at Amarna. So the brother of Akhenaten was called Tuthmoses. He was called Moses. And those are the two characters of the biblical Exodus. But they're not really connected with the major Exodus, the big Exodus. So the big Exodus would have occurred 300 years before or so, 1580 BC. And it's connected with the Hyksos. So the Hyksos are known as the shepherd kings, and they came down into Egypt from Mesopotamia, they say, and they took over Egypt. This is circa, I don't know, 1800 BC, something of that nature. And they became actually fully Egyptianized. You can't really see much difference between the Hyksos shepherd kings and the Theban Egyptians. Caused some tensions, of course, with these people coming down into Egypt. But anyway, they lived alongside each other for a number of centuries. And then they had an eruption, which was the big Santorini eruption. Oh, and before I continue with that, I should say that Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian, he's 1st century, he wrote all about this as well. So he actually quotes from Manetho, and then he wrote an entire Old Testament himself, which is a secular Old Testament known as Antiquities. And in many respects, it's more authoritative than the Old Testament is, because he had sources that we no longer have. His sources came from 600 BC, and they came from the Temple of Jerusalem before it was destroyed.
Wow, of course.
Anyway, Josephus says that the Hyksos were the Israelites. So he is saying, and this is Judaism's greatest historian, he is saying that the Israelites were Egyptians. They were the Hyksos shepherd kings. And that's why the patriarchs in the Bible are all called shepherds, because they were shepherd kings. And people will say, no, they were just, they were humble shepherds, nothing to do with kings. And then you read, of course, in the Bible, it says that Abraham had 318 servants under him. And you think, wow, that's one hell of a shepherd to have 318 shepherds. And then you read Josephus, of course, who has the parallel story, but in a secular fashion. And he says that Abraham had 318 army officers. Now that changes things, because if they were all centurions, then Abraham had a standing army of 30,000 men. Okay, so he's not a shepherd with a few starving, moth-eaten sheep on a hill. He is a shepherd king, only a shepherd king. The Hyksos would have a standing army of 30,000 men, because the Hyksos had the largest army in that era, really, anywhere in that era. So he must have been Hyksos, exactly the same as Josephus Flavius says, that the Israelites were Egyptians. They were Egyptian pharaohs. And people don't like to mention that because it changes the story somewhat, but I think it makes the story more real, because now we can place that story back into real history. And we know exactly what it was, because the Hyksos had an exodus, a very, very familiar one. So the following points come from history. This is nothing to do with the Bible. This is from the history of the Hyksos. So you had these people in Egypt who were known as shepherds. A king of theirs was called Jacob. They wore earrings and hair ringlets, you know, curly side locks of hair, and they were circumcised. Now, who does that? I can't remember. They were involved in a war with the Egyptians, the southern Egyptians. There were storms and darkness. We get that from the Tempest Stella, which tells us all about it. There was a tsunami, the waters parting. There was a pillar of fire and smoke. There was an ash fall. The ash fall, again, was one of the plagues. I don't know if people know that. In the Old Testament, it says that God said unto Moses, take you handfuls of ash from the hearth of the fire and cast it up into the sky, and it will become small ash across the whole land of Egypt. What could that be? Sounds like a volcano to me. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we carry on. So some more points about the Hyksos Exodus. There were some 500,000 people were ejected from Egypt on an exodus. They set off from Pi-Ramesses, Avaris, and they traveled to Jerusalem. And they were a mighty military force, and they destroyed Jericho. Have we heard that story somewhere before, I wonder? Yeah, that's the biblical Exodus. Everything is identical to the biblical Exodus. And this is known history. I'm not making this up. You can look this up anywhere, that the Hyksos had this major exodus. The only reason people will not accept it is because this exodus happened in 1580 BC and not in the time of Ramesses II, which will be sort of 1150 or something BC or 1200. I forget when Ramesses was around, probably 1200, 1220 or something. Because there's no evidence that the Israelite exodus happened during the time of Ramesses. They only say that because the town they went from and left on this exodus was called Pi-Ramesses. And so they say, oh, well, they must have happened at the time of Ramesses II.
But the town couldn't have been named before. The town couldn't have been named before.
Yeah,
he existed.
The name of the town was Avaris, and that's where the Hyksos left from.
So is that just an error in translation somewhere?
No, they renamed it. Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, was known as the Great Chiseler, and he chiseled his name on everything in Egypt and claimed it for himself.
Got you.
And of course, that's why the town became known as Pi-Ramesses.
Right.
But its original name was Avaris, and it was the city from which the Hyksos left. And so this was the biblical Exodus. It was the Hyksos Exodus because the Israelites and Hyksos are the same people. And to me, that doesn't change the story very much, but to Jews and pious Christians, it gets them foaming at the mouth because they don't like it, because they don't want to be associated with Egypt and polytheism and all the rest of it. And so they deny that there is any connection at all. But there is obviously a connection. And the beauty about this connection is we know why the Exodus happened. Nothing to do with the wrath of God. It was the wrath of the volcano at Santorini.
Right.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Santorini. It was an island just north of Crete. And in 1600 BC, it blew its top. The biggest eruption in known history of mankind. And it spread destruction over the whole of that region, across the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a huge explosion. And of course, it caused a huge, great ash fall. It caused 3 days of darkness, of course, exactly as the biblical story says. It caused a great ash fall, just as it says in the biblical text. There was a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke, which people could see from miles around. And there was a parting of the waters, of course, because that always seemed like a very odd, mystical thing, you know. Why did the waters part for the Israelites? Well, it was a tsunami, of course. This was a Mediterranean, a maritime subduction explosion. So the island collapsed before it exploded. It collapsed into its empty chamber. So I don't know if you know these volcanoes. They have a magma chamber underneath the volcano filled with hot lava. And that huffs and puffs and it pumps its way for weeks, months, like it did down in Spain recently in one of the islands in the Canaries. It'll sit there and huff and puff for months, maybe, if it's big enough, throwing out this lava and so on until the chamber is empty. And as soon as the chamber is empty, there is nothing to hold the island up above it. And it just collapses into the empty chamber. And so you get this great subduction in the ocean. And so what happens for the tsunami is as it rolls out across the Mediterranean, the first thing you get is the sea receding, a bit like we had during the Indonesian tsunami. The sea just disappears. And of course, you can imagine the Egyptian army walking out across the beach thinking, you know, where's the sea gone? You know, and there's all these fish flopping around on the beach. So they go around picking up all the fish and they wander out to see where the sea's gone to. And then, of course, the sea rolls back in again. The water did part, but it was a tsunami in the Reed Sea, not in the Red Sea, but in the Reed Sea, which is actually what it's called. If you read it in the Aramaic, it's actually the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea. And this, to me, is proof positive that this actually happened. Because what we have is 5 black swans, maybe 6, I don't know. A black swan being something so incredible that nobody could make up the story because it's too unlikely. So nobody would make up such a stupid story like the sea disappearing unless you had actually seen it yourself happening. But here we not only have one black swan, we have 5 or 6 of them. We have a pillar of fire, a pillar of smoke. We have an ash fall. We have a tsunami, all happening. Oh, and the 3 days of darkness as well. All happening at the same time. All of them being black swans that you would not expect to happen in the normal course of events. But how would any ancient chronicler know that all of those elements are connected with a huge, great volcano if they had not seen the volcano and the ramifications of that volcano upon Egypt? It's quite clear this is a first-hand account, an eyewitness account of what actually happened. And Josephus backs this up by saying that the air was too thick to breathe, and people were inwardly consumed by the thick air. It's exactly what happens in a volcano. If you read the reports from Mount St. Helens when that blew its top, again, people couldn't breathe. They were going around with masks on because they couldn't breathe. And that puts an exact date on this Exodus event. So this Exodus event happened just after 1600 BC, because we've dated the Thera Santorini eruption quite accurately to 1600 BC, because there were loads of olive trees caught in the lava, not the lava, in the pumice, they call it, yeah. And so it's fairly accurately dated to 1600 BC. And the Hyksos Exodus happened in about 1580 BC, about 20 years after.
Yeah, close enough.
Well, it took 20 years, even within the within the history of the Hyksos that we know. It took about 20 years for this to fester, and they had this ongoing dispute for at least a generation, because, of course, I mean, there was a catastrophe across the Eastern Mediterranean. Someone was to blame for it.
Right.
Somebody had upset
a scapegoat, if you like.
Yeah. You don't get away with upsetting the gods. You know, retribution is required. You've upset the gods. And of course, the Southerners blamed the Hyksos, and the Hyksos blamed the Southerners. And before you know it, you end up with a civil war, which is exactly what happened.
Well, you should quickly explain, Ralph, because you said the Hyksos and the Southerners. When the Hyksos invaded, they didn't capture the entire country of Egypt, did they?
No, they mainly inhabited the Delta lands down as far as Cairo. And the rest of Egypt was still controlled by the Theban Egyptians, you might call them, down in Thebes. So yeah, it was, and they actually had different symbolism. So we had the red crown in the north and the white crown down in the south. They had two pharaohs ruling at the same time. But of course, the northern pharaoh, two of the northern pharaohs were called Jacob. Now, where does that name come from?
That bloke with the ladder.
I can't remember. Yeah, him. And his pillow, strange pillow made of stone. Yeah.
Oh, well, the pillow's another interesting one, isn't it? But I don't know if we'll get there.
Well, we can talk about that if you want. That's the sacred meteorite. It turns up in Arthurian legend as well. So very quickly skipping into Arthurian legend, we have, as you do, jumping from, Egypt to, well, they are connected. When we come on to talk about Arthur, maybe sometime later, they are connected, these two stories. But the Holy Grail had several forms. One of the forms was it was the royal blood. So it was the bloodline. It was the sang real, the royal blood. It was supposed to be a chalice as well that captured the royal blood. But it was being the royal blood, it was a princess. And we have this wonderful story within Parsifal of them all standing around this sort of round table. And there's a new knight being initiated, and they're going to parade the Holy Grail for him. And this princess comes in holding a green cloth, and they say to the knight, "Can you see the Grail?" And he's looking around the place and he can't see anything. He says, "No, I can't see a Grail. All I can see is this princess holding a green cloth." And of course, all of the other knights fall around laughing because she is the Grail. She is the bloodline. So that's the Holy Grail. But the other manifestation of the Grail is it was a sacred stone. It was a sacred meteorite. And this sacred meteorite goes back to Egypt. It was the stone that Jacob laid his head on and anointed with oil. It ended up in Greece because of Alexander, who went down into Egypt. And it became the omphalos of Delphi. It went up to Delphi. It's a small thing. It's probably only about 60, 70 centimeters high, conical stone, supposed to be a meteorite, probably metallic, probably magnetic. But from Greece, it went over to Parthia, to Persia, because that's where Alexander went, and it ended up in Persia. Then it came back and it ended up in Edessa. I talk a lot about Edessa in my biblical books. Edessa is in northern Syria. Then it went down to Emesa, sounds the same, but it's a different royal dynasty, in Homs and Hama, which is in modern Syria. And we have pictures of it. Again, it's a conical little stone. And then it's sitting in a temple, of course, because it was sacred. And then Emperor Elagabalus, who came from Homs and Hama, he was the mad emperor who was castrated. Might have been, he might have had a panectomy as well. We're not quite sure. So he might have become androgynous. And he took it to Rome. But he wasn't, so we have images of it in Rome. And again, it's a conical stone. He used to take it around Rome in a chariot, casting gold dust before it.
Right, because he was a devotee of Sol Invictus, wasn't he, Elagabalus?
He was. And we come back to that when we start talking about Jesus, because Jesus was of the same religion. He was a Galilean. And the Galileans were all eunuchs, but we'll talk about that later.
Is this what they used to call the Benben stone in Egypt?
It's the Benben stone. In Egypt, it was called the Benben.
Right.
And again, it's portrayed as being conical there as well. So eventually it became called the Elagabal stone. The Elagabal means the small mountain of God. And it went to Rome. And then, of course, Elagabalus was murdered. They didn't really like him. Appius,
very effeminate, didn't
he had
mix
all
with
of
the
these
Roman
strange,
persuasion.
strange Eastern ways. And he was a
Yes.
eunuch. You were not supposed to be a eunuch and all that sort of stuff. And so they murdered him. And we don't know what happened to the sacred stone after that time. The Scottish Templars say that they have it up in Scotland, but there is no evidence of that. But there we go. So that's a potted history of Jacob's stone. It was a sacred meteorite. Fairly influential. It's been around the world a bit, that stone, but there we go. We don't know where it is. But coming back to the Exodus, that was the biblical Exodus. So the biblical Exodus was the Hyksos Exodus. It's a real event. It was caused by the eruption of Thera, Santorini. And it was much earlier than they say. And of course, these Hyksos, when they were thrown out of Egypt on this Exodus, they are the people who destroyed Jericho. And so again, it fits in very, very well with the biblical story, because they keep saying, oh, there's no evidence for the Exodus because, you know, Jericho had been abandoned for 300 years before the Exodus happened. Yeah, but only if you've got the wrong date for the Exodus, chaps. If you get the right date and you understand that the Israelites were the Hyksos, then these are the people who destroyed Jericho.
So where did you say the Hyksos came from originally when they first came to Egypt?
We don't entirely know. They say that they came from Mesopotamia, from perhaps Haran, which is where Abraham came
Yeah,
from,
that ties in. Yeah.
And Haran is at Edessa, of course, this town that I keep talking about in the New Testament. It's the same place. It's right next door to Edessa. Right. So it's between the Tigris and the Euphrates, up in northern Syria.
What do you think would be the motivation for the Hyksos when they get kicked out to target Jerusalem? Why not find somewhere else to settle?
Well, I think they did, you see. I mean, the story says that they went to Jerusalem, but the evidence seems to say that they went to many places, because we have the history of Scota and Gaithalos, Pharaoh I, and they didn't go to Jerusalem. They ended up going to Spain and going round to Ireland and Scotland. Right. There is some evidence that some of them populated the other islands across the Mediterranean and went to Greece, Macedonia, anyway, southern Greece, because there is a story of the Spartans being cousins of the Israelites. Wow. That comes from the book of Maccabees. And of course, if you look at the history of the Spartans, they were a invading aristocracy and army who took over another people. I don't know if you know the history of the Spartans, but it was a two-tiered society. It was run by the Spartans, but the Spartan was only a very, very small elite. They never got to more than about 6,000 people, I think it was. A very, very precarious elite controlling the country. And all of the work, everything else, was done by the helots.
That's right. Yep.
Who were a subjugated people that they had taken over. And of course, if you had some aristocracy coming out of Egypt, that's exactly what might happen. You know, they might take over another population and dominate them, which is exactly what happened.
So you think Leonidas could have been a descendant of the Hyksos?
Yeah. I mean, this is quite possibly why we have the Sea People invasion. Nobody has successfully explained the Sea People invasion of Egypt and the Levant. Why did these widely separated islands all across the Mediterranean suddenly decide to all get together with 1,000 ships and invade the world's superpower, Egypt? It doesn't make any sense. What on earth made them? What gave them the thought that they could destroy Egypt? And why on earth would they want to in the first place? Well, if they were all exiled Hyksos, who had been sitting in these islands for the last 2-300 years, muttering about, what did the Egyptians ever do for us, sort of thing, and slowly getting more and more powerful in their islands in terms of their technology and their populations. And suddenly in the mid sort of 12th century BC, they suddenly decide to all get together, 1,000 ships, and invade Egypt. Well, now we've got a rationale for that, because they were kicked out 300 odd years before. Now they want to get their own back.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
because
and that's why the Sea People invasion happened. That's that was the reason for it.
For context, the Sea People invasion happens at the end of the Bronze Age, around the Bronze Age collapse, when Ramesses is pharaoh. He defeats them, doesn't he? Is it Ramesses?
Ramesses the third. Yes.
Third. Yeah. So this is after. So the hypothesis is that the Sea. When you think from the biblical point of view, and you understand why, the story is told that the Exodus, the Moses leads the Israelites together in a conglomeration into the Holy Land. But what we're saying is that the Exodus was more of a scattering across the Mediterranean, maybe even Sparta and other islands across the Mediterranean, and then a few centuries later, they get back together or plan some sort of invasion, which is recorded by the Egyptians as the invasion of the Sea People. Is that about right?
Because one of the big contingents, of course, of the Sea People were the Greeks. They came out of Macedonia, because this is long before established Greek history. We're talking sort of 1100s BC. Greek history doesn't really come to the fore until about the 700s BC. So it was a long time before classical Greece came along, and some of the Sea People were the Greeks. And of course, we have a great similarity, of course, with the Iliad and the invasion of Troy, because how many times do you get 1,000-ship consortium going to attack a place? It sounds very much like the invasion of Troy, as if Troy was actually, because I don't write very much about this because it's very tenuous. There's not much proof, and I like to write books that have proof rather than just conjecture. So I just write about this in like about 4 or 5 paragraphs. So I don't dwell on this. But I made a connection between the invasion of Troy in the Iliad and the Sea People invasion of Egypt, because of course the Greek horse, for getting into Troy doesn't make a great deal of sense, because there were not many people who venerated the horse, as a sacred animal. So why would you give a horse to be taken inside the city? But of course, within Egypt, they venerated the bull. And of course, the bull was an apis, whereas the Trojan or the Greek horse was a hippos. Apis, hippos. It sounds the same to me. I think it was a Greek bull that they gave them, not a Greek horse, the Trojan horse. I think it was the apis bull.
Right. And
that's how they got into the city.
Is it not fairly secure, the location of Troy? Schliemann...
It was invented by Schliemann. No, it's not secure at all. There is no direct evidence that is Troy. Right. It's a great story, and lots of tourists go to see it. But if you read Herodotus, he says they went to Egypt. So it's not entirely secure that is Troy whatsoever. There's nothing that identifies it as Troy. And that headdress, that golden headdress, loads of people think that was made by the Turks.
I was just going to say, you must be really popular with the Turkish tourist board.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Well, I can only say it as I see it. I don't think that is Troy. The two people were the same. Okay, you can have arguments between two people who are the same. The Greeks, they had the same name. One was the Danoi, and the other one was the Dananoia or something. Anyway, they both had the same name, the Greeks and the Trojans.
Right.
And they were fighting over the face of Helen, and of course, Helen in Egyptian, it means the face. There are lots of connections anyway. It's something I might need to research further and make, because as I say, I haven't done very much work on this. It's just elements that seem to make sense, but I don't have enough evidence for. I mean, the other one was the judges. So with this Sea People invasion, we have the text from Ramesses III, and he says that the Sea People came and attacked the Egyptians with fire set before them.
Right.
Okay. And then you read Judges and the history of the judges, the Israelite judges. And when they fought their enemies, and I forget who the enemy was called, but I link them up with the Egyptians. The judges came and they attacked their enemy with fire set before them in exactly the same fashion. And in fact, we get more information from the biblical text than we do from Ramesses III. It says that their army were all given pots of clay with fire at the bottom of them. And then they lined up around the enemy camp at midnight, obviously when it was dark, and they all smashed their pots so their fire would suddenly be seen. And then they marched through the camp with this fire set before them. The story is the same, that the Israelites were the sea people, returning sea people.
Wasn't there something called Greek fire that the Greeks used
Yeah, that was
in maritime?
from later. That was supposed to be squirted.
Right.
So that wasn't just to intimidate people. That was actually to throw napalm on them, basically. I'm not sure how they were supposed to throw it, but somehow they managed to throw this Greek fire. Basically, it was napalm.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating.
So yeah, it is an interesting story, and it sort of makes sense of what did not make sense before. That's why I like this research that I've done. It makes sense of things that were totally unintelligible. One of the good things that came out of this, one of the interesting things, again, making sense of things that made no sense, was when Joseph came back down into Egypt. So they had been in my text, they had been on the Exodus, and now Joseph, him of the coat of many colors, is coming back down into Egypt to settle there. And he brings his brothers down, because remember, Joseph had gone down on his own, and then he'd become very successful. He'd become the prime minister of Egypt and probably the high priest of On, Heliopolis. So he had become very successful. Obviously, he was fully Egyptianized at that point. He must have spoken fluent Egyptian, understood all of the Egyptian customs and gods, etc. And now he's inviting his brothers back down into Egypt as well. And he says to them, you're going to meet Pharaoh. Now, when you meet Pharaoh, whatever you do, don't say that we are shepherds. Say instead that we are bull breeders, and we've been bull breeders for generations, because shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, and we will not be allowed to settle in Egypt. And of course, this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because the Egyptians never had any problem with eating meat or keeping sheep or anything of that nature. Makes no sense whatsoever, unless you know that the Israelites were shepherd kings. So this is talking about religion and society and politics, not agriculture. So what he's saying to his brothers is, when you meet Pharaoh, don't say you are shepherd kings, Hyksos, because we are an abomination to the Egyptians. Well, of course they were, because they'd just been thrown out on a massive great exodus only 100 years before, or whatever, however soon they came back into the country. Say instead that you are Apis bull worshippers, which was the state religion of Egypt. Otherwise, you will not be able to stay and settle in Egypt. It's talking about politics. It's talking about the Hyksos shepherd kings. And not only that, it's talking about the Zodiac. It's talking about procession. Will your listeners be familiar with procession?
Yes. I mean, briefly, it's the 26,000 year cycle that the constellations revolve due to the Earth's tilt on its axis. But I mean, I think most people listening are tuned into it.
Well, this is part of the problem, because the other problem for the Hyksos, apart from Santorini blowing its top, is that the constellations changed while they were in Egypt. And so Taurus changed into Aries in about 1750 BC.
Right.
And the Hyksos shepherd kings changed to Aries. That's why they called themselves shepherds, because the dominant constellation, the great month, was now the great month of Aries, not Taurus. Whereas many of the southern Egyptians down in Thebes kept worshipping and venerating the Apis bull, Taurus. And so now we had a contention, a religious contention between these two peoples, as well as everything else that was going on. And it was perhaps the religious differences between these two people, which again forced the major great exodus in 1580 BC. And so this is what they're talking about in this conversation with Pharaoh. They're talking about procession. They're talking about the change between Taurus and Aries, between bulls and sheep. And so what I like about this is quite possibly we have a verbatim conversation between Pharaoh and Joseph, dating back to whenever this was. It would have been something like 1400 BC or so. So 3,400 years ago, we have a verbatim conversation between these two people, which has been copied down through the ages into the modern era, and we know exactly what Pharaoh was saying. And that sort of makes it real to me. I mean, not real in the spiritual context, I'm a Gnostic atheist, but in terms of history, we not only have artifacts coming out of the ground, a bit of archaeology here and there, we now have a verbatim conversation between Pharaoh and his prime minister in 3,400 years ago, which I find to be quite fascinating, really.
Well, Ralph, we're just ticking up to an hour now, and I hate to have to end because I could listen to you all night.
And I could go on all night, yes.
You just interested me then with the statement, I'm a Gnostic atheist. That seems a bit of a juxtaposition.
Yes, it does.
How's that work?
Well, an agnostic doesn't know. Right. A Gnostic knows. So it's an atheist who knows who the gods were. And they're not necessarily the gods that you think that they were. Put it this way, I became a Mason, and of course, to become a Mason, you must believe in a God of some nature. But the nature of that God is not given. And so you can be a Gnostic atheist. It depends what you think God is.
Right. Are you of the school of thought of Ealdeboth, the sort of inferior God who created this realm that we live in now, and that there is something higher above the Sophia and all the rest of it?
Yeah, no, I'm a believer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which comes from Masonic law. I mean, that's part of Masonic teaching. That there were ancient astronauts, right. And that is what was perceived to be the god.
The Anunnaki, is that the guys?
Well, yes, I don't like that name because it has too many connotations put onto it.
Too many consonants as well.
Yeah, just call it the spaceman. Call it 2001. The unidentified beings who ran across the galaxy in their spaceship, and of course we got no idea how or what that looked like. but did a little bit of education, as per 2001: A Space Odyssey. One of the best films ever made, of course, if people haven't watched it.
Of course,
And it
yes.
shows you the whole history of mankind. That's how mankind became civilized.
Excellent.
That's another conversation for another time, isn't it?
For
Ancient
another
aliens.
time, yes.
Yeah, we've skirted around that so far.
Hey, Akhenaten wasn't one of these elongated, skulled aliens, was he?
Well, why do you think that Akhenaten looks exactly like the modern grey?
Oh,
Where do you think they based that look upon? I'm not the only person who would subscribe to this. It's a Masonic thing, of course. They made the grey look like Akhenaten because they knew that Akhenaten based his body design upon what he thought the gods looked like. He didn't look like that at all, of course. That is sculpted. We have busts and statues of him as a normal person. He did not look like that. He wanted his artisans to carve him in that shape, in that style, in order to look like the gods, because that's what he thought the gods looked like.
That's right. You can see some carvings of Akhenaten with Nefertiti by his side, and they just look like plain old
Normal
average
people.
humans.
Yeah, of course they do.
Yeah.
But the grey was Akhenaten. It was based on Akhenaten. So he's fairly influential, this guy.
Just a bit. Well,
him and his little cult. If you watch Wild Wild Country, and you can see what happened to him and all of the problems he had trying to keep his little cult together.
Bhagwan, wasn't it? Bhagwan.
Yeah, Bhagwan. That's his name. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good doc that on Netflix.
But he actually, I mean, how mad it got. I mean, it got just as mad, of course, under Akhenaten. He tried to poison the local town. They tried to poison everyone in the local town because they were having an argument with the local town. Quite mad.
Well, Ralph, it's been an absolute pleasure. The links for your website where people can find your books will be in the show notes, as ever. And I'll put a link to your YouTube channel because you've been doing YouTube videos on all these sorts of topics as well.
Yeah. Yes, I've got about 20 YouTube videos out there, just taking elements out of my books. And I've got a Facebook site, which is quite active. I've got a lot of stories on there. I do a lot on climate because I'm a climate scientist as well. I don't know if you know.
Yeah.
I do lots of things. I used to be a lorry driver. I was a coal miner. I used to be an airline captain. Various jobs, here and there.
Yeah.
Well,
you name it. I've had a go at it. That's why I'm a polymath. You see, I have a fairly good understanding of lots of different.
Do you know, I was so
industries.
tempted to just sack off ancient history and talk climate change with you.
Well, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that another time. Why not?
Well, it's becoming more and more pertinent the way things are going. It's in the messaging constantly, and I think I probably fall in the same camp as you when it comes to heresy on that score. So yeah, maybe another time. But we should sign off and just say thanks for joining us, Ralph. I've really enjoyed it. And we've had loads of good comments on the chat from other YouTube. We've had a lot of other YouTubers in the chat. I saw Ziggy down there and Matt from the Apocalypse YouTube channel. A few others.
Excellent.
So check out Ralph's channel. All the links will be in the show notes. And we're going to sign off for now. Nice to meet you, Ralph.
Great to be on.
Just stay on the line for us for 1 minute while we play ourselves out.
Cheers, Ralph.
Cheers, thanks.
The rest of you, we'll catch you after a short interlude, just for a bit of housekeeping. Okay. Ta-ra!
Bye.